For 50 years, every textbook has told the same story. Life on Earth began at the bottom of the ocean, in the dark, in the deep, at hydrothermal vents where scalding mineral-rich water meets the cold seafloor. That's the story. 50 years, every biology class, every documentary, the same answer, repeated so many times it stopped feeling like a theory and started feeling like a fact. And then, last month, a drilling core came up out of a rice field in South Korea, inside a 7-kilometre scar left by an asteroid impact 42,300 years ago. Researchers pulled out something that has never been found inside a confirmed impact crater before. Stromatolites, layered microbial architecture, the oldest biological structures on this planet. The same lineage of organisms that 3 billion years ago pumped oxygen into a breathless sky and made complex life possible. Sitting inside a wound from space, fused with chemistry that has no business existing in a single place on Earth, hydrothermal heat from below, and meteoritic metal from beyond this world, woven into the same biological mat. And now, very quietly, researchers are asking the question nobody wanted to ask. What if the ocean was never the answer? What if the answer was always the craters? Because if it was, if life didn't begin in the deep sea but inside an asteroid wound, then what does that tell us about Mars, Europa, and every silent planet still waiting to be drilled? Stay with me on this one. Hit subscribe if you haven't yet, get comfortable, and don't go anywhere. Because we're about to go somewhere most textbooks never thought to look. Part 1. The crater. No one knew was a crater. For the longest time, the Hapcheon Basin was just considered a basin. Geologists looked at it and saw a roughly circular low-lying valley surrounded by hills, and the explanation that fit was the kind of explanation we use for thousands of similar features around the world. Erosion, differential weathering, maybe an old fault structure, maybe a pocket of softer rock that the rivers carved out over millions of years, while the harder rock around it stayed standing. That kind of story is so common in geology that you can apply it almost anywhere, and it will sound reasonable. So that is what people did. The basin sat there, hosting agriculture, hosting villages, and nobody seriously suspected it was anything else. The confirmation that this was actually an impact crater did not come until 2020. That is recent. That is within the lifespan of phones with face recognition. The team that confirmed it had to find specific kinds of evidence that only form when rock gets hit by something travelling at cosmic speeds. They found shatter cones, which are these distinctive cone-shaped fracture patterns in rock that radiate outward from a point of impact and only form under shock pressures that no normal geological process on Earth can generate. You do not get shatter cones from earthquakes. You do not get them from volcanism. You get them when rock is briefly compressed by a shock wave moving faster than the speed of sound through stone. They also found planar deformation features in quartz crystals. This is one of the most reliable signatures of a hypervelocity impact. Quartz is a tough mineral with an orderly atomic structure, and under the right kind of shock, that structure gets disrupted in very specific microscopic patterns that look like parallel lines under a microscope. These patterns cannot be faked by slow geological processes. They are essentially fingerprints of a moment when the crystal was hit hard enough and fast enough that its atoms briefly forgot how to be quartz. Then came the drilling. The team pulled up cores from 142 meters down into the basin, and the layers they recovered told a story that fit nothing except a giant impact followed by tens of thousands of years of lake sediment slowly filling in the bowl. Then in 2025, gravity surveys refined the picture even more. When something the size of a small mountain hits the ground, it leaves a density signature, a subtle change in how mass is distributed in the crust, and that signature shows up in extremely sensitive gravity measurements taken from above. The shape of the gravity anomaly at Hapcheon matched what you would expect from a circular impact structure of about that size, with a central uplift and a deeper outer ring, the standard architecture of a complex crater. So why did this take until 2020 to figure out? Why did a wound this big stay hidden for so long? The answer is that Earth is very good at erasing its own scars. We have weather, We have rivers. We have plate tectonics that recycle entire ocean floors back into the mantle. We have forests and farms that grow over everything that does not move. Compare Hapcheon to something like Meteor Crater in Arizona, which is famous and obvious and visible from space, with that perfect bowl shape sitting in dry desert. Meteor Crater is only about 1.25 kilometers across, much smaller than Hapcheon, but it sits in a place where almost no rain falls and almost no vegetation grows, so it has stayed sharp and recognizable for 50,000 years. Hapcheon is more than 5 times larger, but it sits in a wet, green, agriculturally active part of the world, so it got softened, it got buried, it got farmed. This is the first uncomfortable thought we need to sit with. If a crater this large, this recent, formed during the time of anatomically modern humans, can stay invisible to science until 2020, how many other craters of similar size are still out there, hiding under forests and farms and lakes and city centres all over the planet? The current count of confirmed impact structures on Earth is somewhere around 200. Most experts will tell you the real number is probably much higher, maybe by a factor of 5 or 10, especially for older craters that have been worn down or buried by sediment. We are walking around on a planet whose violent history we have only partially mapped. And here is where the central thread starts to take shape. If craters can hide in plain sight, then so can the environments those craters created. So can the chemistry. So can, potentially, the origins. The places where life might have actually started might be sitting under our feet right now, disguised as ordinary terrain, waiting for somebody to drill in the right place. The Hapcheon team drilled in the right place, and what they pulled up changed the conversation. But to understand why, we have to first understand exactly what happened on the day that asteroid arrived. Part 2. The explosion that reset a landscape. Imagine you're standing in the valley that will one day become Hapcheon, 42,300 years ago, on what would have been an otherwise ordinary day. The world is in the late stages of an ice age. There are mammoths out there somewhere, and saber-toothed cats, and groups of Homo sapiens already spread across most of the continents. The sky over Korea that day was probably overcast or clear, who knows, but it was a sky like ours, the same blue, the same atmosphere, the same physics. And then a point of light appears. It is not a star. It is moving. It is brighter than anything you have ever seen, brighter than the sun, growing brighter still, and it is coming straight down. The asteroid is 200 meters wide, which is roughly the height of a 60-story building, and it is moving at somewhere between 15 and 20 kilometers per second. That is around 40 to 60,000 miles per hour. At those speeds, the air itself becomes a problem. The atmosphere does not have time to get out of the way, so it compresses violently in front of the rock, and that compression heats the air to temperatures of tens of thousands of degrees. The asteroid begins to glow. It begins to shed material. By the time it is a few seconds away from the ground, it is a fireball brighter than the sun, and the shockwave it is pushing in front of it is already starting to do damage to the landscape below. Then it hits. When 200 meters of rock travelling at 20 kilometers per second slams into the crust of the Earth, the energy released is about 1,500 megatons. To put that in human terms, the entire nuclear arsenal of the world today, all the warheads from every country combined, is somewhere around 3,000 to 4,000 megatons. So this single event released roughly 1/3 to 1/2 of the destructive potential of every nuclear weapon currently held by humanity, all in one place, all in one instant. About 30 Tsar bombers, going off simultaneously in one valley. The Tsar bomber, when it was tested over the Arctic, broke windows hundreds of miles away and produced a mushroom cloud 60 kilometers tall. Now picture 30 of those, stacked on top of each other in a single explosion. In the first second, the rock at the impact point did not melt or shatter so much as it ceased to exist as solid matter. Pressures climbed to millions of atmospheres. Temperatures rocketed past the surface temperature of the sun. The asteroid itself was largely vaporized in the impact, along with a comparable mass of the target rock. A column of hot gas, dust, and pulverized stone shot upward, punching through the atmosphere. A shock wave radiated outward at the speed of sound and beyond, flattening forests for tens of kilometers in every direction, snapping trees like matchsticks, igniting fires. Any large animal within a radius of about 10 to 15 kilometers would have been killed instantly by the heat pulse alone, before the shock wave even arrived. The ground itself rang like a bell, transmitting seismic energy that would have been felt as a serious earthquake hundreds of kilometers away. Then comes the part that almost nobody thinks about, but it is the part that matters most for our story. The crater that formed was not just a hole, it was a melt pool. A significant fraction of the rock at the impact site stayed in place, but it was now liquid. The bottom of the crater became a lake of molten silicate, hundreds of meters thick in the centre, slowly cooling. The walls of the crater were heavily fractured, riddled with cracks that went deep into the bedrock, and in the moments after impact, as gravity pulled the central mass back upward in what is called central uplift rebound, the geometry of the wound settled into the classic shape of a complex crater, a circular outer rim, a depressed inner basin, a central peak or peak ring lifted up from the deep crust by the rebound. Now here is where the story starts to turn, because while the surface above the crater was sterilized, while the immediate landscape was turned into a wasteland of ash and shattered stone, something was happening underneath that wound that is, in retrospect, kind of incredible. The melt pool was hot, the fractured rock around it was hot. Water from the surrounding water table started to seep into those fractures, and when groundwater meets hot rock, you get hydrothermal circulation. Water heats up, rises, picks up dissolved minerals from the rock, cools at the surface, sinks back down, picks up more minerals, and so on. The wound becomes a chemical engine. What was, in 1 second, the most violent event the region had seen in millions of years became, over the next centuries and millennia, one of the most chemically interesting environments on the planet. Heat, water, mineral-rich fluids, a bowl-shaped depression that filled with rain and groundwater to form a freshwater lake. Catastrophe transformed itself into chemistry. Destruction became creation. And this is the paradox we're going to keep coming back to, the paradox the rest of the story turns on. Sometimes the most violent events on a planet are the ones that set the stage for the most delicate processes imaginable. The wound from space, in other words, became something almost the opposite of a wound. It became a cradle. And what grew in that cradle eventually is what those Korean researchers pulled out of the ground in 2026. Part 3. The strange thing inside the crater. The drilling cores from Hapcheon came up, layer by layer, like pages of a book being turned in slow motion. The team was looking at sediment that had accumulated in the post-impact lake, expecting to learn about climate, about regional geology, about how the crater filled in over time. What they pulled out of certain layers was something nobody on the team was really expecting to find. Stromatolites. If you have never heard the word, you can think of stromatolites as the oldest architecture on Earth. They are layered, dome-shaped or columnar structures, sometimes only a few centimetres tall, sometimes several metres, that form when communities of microbes, mostly cyanobacteria, grow in mats on a surface and trap thin films of sediment between successive generations of growth. The microbes secrete sticky substances. Sediment grains drift down through the water and get caught in those sticky films. The microbes then grow upward through the new layer toward the light, and the cycle repeats. Over decades, centuries, millennia, this slow, patient process builds up a layered structure that records, in physical form, the activity of an entire ecosystem. These are not fossils in the traditional sense. They are not bones. They are not impressions of bodies. They are constructions. They are buildings. They are what life looks like when it spends 1,000 years quietly making a home for itself, one layer at a time, and they are the single most important biosignature in the deep geological record of Earth, because the oldest unambiguous evidence we have for life on this planet, the evidence that pushes the origin of life back to at least 3.5 billion years ago, comes from stromatolite structures preserved in ancient rocks in places like the Pilbara region of Western Australia and parts of southern Africa. So when the Korean team identified stromatolite structures in the sediment of a 42,000-year-old impact crater lake, the immediate reaction in the relevant scientific circles was, frankly, what? This was unprecedented. Stromatolites had never been confirmed inside a young, well-dated impact crater before. Microbial mats and films, sure, those have been found in other crater lakes. But proper layered stromatolite architecture, recording sustained ecosystem activity over time in a freshwater lake created directly by an asteroid impact. That was new. The location of these stromatolites within the crater also tells a story. They were found at what would have been the lake margin, in the shallow zone where sunlight could reach the substrate and where wave action would have gently moved sediment around. This is exactly where you would expect photosynthetic microbes to set up shop. They need light, they need shallow water, they need a stable surface to grow on. The Hapcheon crater lake, sometime after the violence of its birth had cooled into the slower violence of hydrothermal circulation, had given them all three. When the team examined the stromatolites in detail, they could see the lamination, the layered structure, with the naked eye in some places. Thin alternating bands, each one representing a slightly different period in the life of the mat. Some layers darker, some lighter. Some richer in mineral content, some richer in organic residue. Each layer was a year, or a season, or a single bloom event in a community of organisms that had figured out somehow how to make a living inside the chemistry of an impact crater. And this is where the implications start opening up. Because the cyanobacteria-driven mat communities that build stromatolites today are direct descendants, biochemically and ecologically, of the same kinds of communities that built the oldest stromatolites in the geological record. We are looking, in essence, at a modern reenactment of one of the most ancient ecological scenes on this planet. The actors are not the same individuals, obviously, but the script they are following is the same script. The biochemistry is the same, the strategy is the same, the output in the form of those layered structures is the same. So now ask yourself the central question. If a modern impact crater can host this kind of microbial ecosystem, complete with stromatolites, just 42,000 years after a planetary scale catastrophe, what does that suggest about the very early Earth? An early Earth that was getting hit by asteroids and comets at a much higher rate than today. An early Earth that, every few thousand years on average, was generating new impact crater lakes somewhere on its surface. An early Earth that was, in essence, running this same experiment over and over and over again on different parts of the planet, with different chemistries, different climates, different starting conditions. The traditional view treats impacts as a problem for early life. Sterilizing events, setbacks, resets. What if some of them, instead, were the original setups? What if life was not just surviving the impacts but, in some cases, being kicked off by them? What if the wounds were the wombs? The team at Hapcheon did not come out and make that claim. Scientists in published papers tend to be careful, and rightly so. But the question is now sitting on the table in a way it never quite has before. And the chemistry they found inside those stromatolites is what really pushes the question into uncomfortable territory. Because the chemistry should not exist. Two signatures from two completely different worlds woven into the same sediment. We will get to that. But first we need to talk about why stromatolites in particular carry so much weight, why finding them anywhere is a big deal, and why finding them here, in this place, at this time, in this kind of crater, is the kind of thing that quietly rearranges the furniture of an entire field. Part 4. Stromatolites, Earth's oldest biological architecture. Stromatolites are, in a very real sense, the oldest known biological structures on the planet. The earliest examples we have are from rocks dated to about 3.5 billion years ago, found in the Pilbara Craton of Western Australia. Some researchers have proposed evidence for stromatolite-like structures in even older rocks, pushing the age back toward 3.7 billion years, though those claims are debated. Either way, we're talking about a time when Earth was very young, when the oceans had only just stabilized, when the atmosphere was still mostly nitrogen and carbon dioxide, with almost no free oxygen, when the moon was much closer and the days were much shorter, and somehow, in that alien version of our planet, microbial communities were already building. The thing to grasp about stromatolites is that they are evidence not just of life, but of organized life. They are evidence of community. A single bacterium does not build a stromatolite. A whole layered ecosystem does, with different microbial species occupying different microzones within the mat. There are usually photosynthetic organisms on top, capturing sunlight and producing oxygen. Below them are organisms that eat the organic matter the photosynthesizers produce. Below those, in the dark anoxic zones, are organisms that recycle the waste products of everything above. The whole structure is a vertically integrated metabolism, layered like a city, with each level depending on the levels above and below. For most of Earth's history, stromatolites were the dominant macroscopic life form on the planet. From 3.5 billion years ago up until about 500 million years ago, if you walked along the shore of any shallow sea, you would have walked past mile after mile of stromatolite reefs. They built coastlines, they built shallow seafloors, they were the world. Then complex animal life evolved, and many of those animals turned out to really enjoy eating microbial mats, and the great age of stromatolites came to an end. They survived only in places where grazing animals could not reach them, like in extremely salty water where most animals cannot live. That is why a place like Shark Bay in Western Australia is so famous. The water there is too salty for most grazers, and as a result modern stromatolites still grow there, looking almost exactly like their 3 billion-year-old ancestors. Walking through Shark Bay at low tide is, in some real sense, walking through a living museum of the early Earth. The shapes are the same. The biochemistry is the same. The slow, patient layering is the same. The big deal about cyanobacteria, the dominant builders of these structures, is that they are oxygen producers. They invented oxygenic photosynthesis. They are the reason there is free oxygen in our atmosphere. Roughly 2.5 billion years ago, in an event geologists call the Great Oxidation Event, cyanobacteria pumped out so much oxygen for so long that they finally overwhelmed the chemical sinks in the ocean and atmosphere, and free oxygen began to accumulate. That oxygen eventually made complex animal life possible, made us possible. So when you look at a stromatolite, ancient or modern, you are looking at a structure built by the lineage that, more than any other, made our world the world it is. The atmosphere you are breathing right now traces directly back to ancestors of the same kinds of organisms that built that stromatolite. So now bring that context back to Hapcheon. The Korean team did not just find some random microbial residue in their cores. They found a structure built by descendants of the most consequential lineage in the history of life on this planet. They found that lineage doing what it has always done, building, layering, recording, but doing it inside the chemistry of an asteroid wound, in a freshwater lake that did not exist before a stone fell out of the sky. This raises a question that I think is genuinely interesting. Why do these systems form in crater environments at all? You might expect a crater lake, with its weird mineral chemistry and its hydrothermal heat and its history of violence, to be a hostile place for the kind of patient, long-term ecosystem building that stromatolites require. And yet, here they are. Apparently the conditions inside Hapcheon were not hostile at all. They were welcoming. The lake was stable enough, long enough, with the right balance of light and nutrients and chemistry, for one of the oldest biological strategies on the planet to set up shop and start writing its slow autobiography in the sediment. This points to something important. Stromatolites are not just fossils. They are environmental recorders. The chemistry of each layer reflects the chemistry of the water at the time that layer formed. The mineral composition tells you about what was dissolved in the lake. The organic content tells you about how productive the ecosystem was. The thickness and morphology tell you about water depth, current strength, light availability. By studying a stromatolite, you can reconstruct the environment that built it, year by year, in some cases. And what the Hapcheon stromatolites are recording is something that, frankly, breaks the existing categories. They are recording the chemistry of a place where the ordinary rules of Earth chemistry were briefly suspended, where the ordinary rules of space chemistry were briefly imported, and where, somehow, those two sets of rules combined to create an environment in which life thrived. Which brings us to the part of the story that, the more I read about it, the harder it is to look away from. The chemistry inside those stromatolites is not normal Earth chemistry. It is something stranger. Part 5. The Chemistry Paradox Inside Hapcheon. When the team analysed the chemistry of the Hapcheon stromatolites and the surrounding sediments, they found two signals that, in any normal geological setting on Earth, should not be sitting next to each other in the same rock. The first signal was a europium anomaly, which is one of the classic fingerprints of high-temperature hydrothermal activity. The second was an osmium isotope signature consistent with extraterrestrial material, which is the fingerprint of, basically, asteroid stuff. Earthborne hydrothermal heat and spaceborne metals woven together in the same biological structure. Let me unpack what each of those signals means and why their coexistence is so strange. Europium is one of the rare Earth elements, and in most natural settings on Earth, the relative abundances of the rare earths in a sample tend to follow predictable patterns set by their behaviour in melts and waters. But hot fluids, the kind that circulate through fractured rock around a heat source, behave differently. They preferentially mobilise europium relative to the other rare earths, and they deposit it out of solution when conditions change. So if you find a sample where europium is enriched relative to its neighbours in the periodic table, that is a strong hint that hot mineral-rich water passed through that material. A europium anomaly is the chemical equivalent of a steam mark. It says, hot fluid was here. Finding a europium anomaly in the Hapcheon sediments is consistent with what we already inferred from the impact physics. The crater would have hosted a long-lived hydrothermal system, with water cycling through the fractured hot rock for thousands of years after the impact, picking up minerals, depositing them elsewhere, building chemical gradients. So far, this signal makes sense. It confirms the hydrothermal model. It tells us the lake was not just a passive bowl of water sitting on top of a wound. It was an active chemical system with mineral-rich fluids being injected into it from below. Now we turn to the osmium. Osmium is a heavy metal, and it has different isotopes that exist in different ratios depending on where the material came from. The osmium isotope ratios in Earth's crust are different from the osmium isotope ratios in most asteroids. Specifically, asteroidal material tends to have a less radiogenic osmium signature, because it has not been exposed to the same crustal weathering and recycling processes that have shaped Earth's surface chemistry. So when you find sediment with osmium isotope ratios that look distinctly extraterrestrial, the most reasonable interpretation is that some of the metal in that sediment came from space, specifically in this case from the asteroid itself. When the asteroid hit Hapcheon, a portion of its mass was vaporized, and that vaporized material was distributed across the crater and the surrounding region. Some of it fell back into the developing crater lake. Some of it was carried into the lake by post-impact erosion, and some of it, dissolved as ions in the hydrothermal fluids, eventually got incorporated into the chemistry of the lake water and into the biological structures forming in the lake. The osmium signature in the stromatolites is, in a very real sense, asteroid metal that became part of a microbial ecosystem. This is where the implications start getting interesting. The stromatolites at Hapcheon are not just structures built by Earth life in an Earth lake. They are structures built by Earth life in an Earth lake whose chemistry was significantly modified by extraterrestrial input, with metals that originated outside of this planet woven into the matrix of the biological building blocks. The line between Earth chemistry and space chemistry gets blurry inside that crater. The biology is using both. Now, this does not mean that life at Hapcheon came from space. The microbes that built those stromatolites are clearly Earth life, descended from the same ancestors as all other Earth cyanobacteria. We are not talking about panspermia in any direct sense, where life itself arrived on the asteroid. What we're talking about is something more subtle. We're talking about an environment in which the raw materials for biology, the metals and elements that life uses to do chemistry, are partially of extraterrestrial origin. We're talking about an impact hydrothermal reactor, a system in which Earth's water and Earth's geology interact with delivered space materials to create chemistry that does not occur naturally anywhere else. And once you have that picture in your mind, you start to see why this matters for the origin of life conversation. The very early Earth was bombarded by far more asteroids and comets than it is today, including some that were significantly larger than the Hapcheon impactor. Each one of those events would have created its own version of an impact hydrothermal reactor. Each one would have brought its own delivery of extraterrestrial metals and organic compounds. Each one would have generated its own freshwater crater lake with its own unique chemistry. And these reactors would have run for thousands of years, in some cases for millions, doing their slow chemical work, distilling and concentrating and reacting and recombining whatever chemistry was available to them. Compare this to the deep-sea hydrothermal vent picture. Vents are real. The chemistry there is also interesting. But ocean water is salty, and that salinity poses problems for the kinds of delicate biochemistry that early life would have needed to assemble. Ocean water also dilutes everything. Whatever organic compounds form near a vent gets spread out into a vast volume of seawater, making it hard to reach the concentrations needed for the next chemical step. And ocean water does not cycle. It does not have wet-dry cycles. It does not have the kind of concentration mechanisms that some of the most promising prebiotic chemistry experiments have shown to be important. Hapcheon, by contrast, is a closed basin, fresh water, with hydrothermal heat, with extraterrestrial material delivery, with a shoreline that experiences wet-dry cycling as the lake level fluctuates with the seasons and centuries. It is, on paper, a much better prebiotic chemistry reactor than a deep-sea vent, and the fact that we can confirm, with stromatolites and sediment chemistry, that this kind of system actually hosts thriving microbial ecosystems is a serious data point in favour of an alternative origin of life model that has been gaining momentum for the last 15 years. The central thread of this story, just to make sure we are still on it, is that life on Earth might not have started where we have been telling ourselves it started. The deep-sea vent model has dominated the conversation for 50 years, but the chemistry at Hapcheon is consistent with a different story, in which life began in impact-generated hydrothermal crater lakes, in environments where Earth chemistry and space chemistry mixed in ways that no other natural setting on this planet can replicate. Hold on to that thread. It is going to start pulling in directions that affect how we look at every other planet in this solar system before we are done. But first, we need to talk about how long these systems can last. Because one of the most striking things about Hapcheon is not just what it is, but how patient it has been. Part 6. The 27,000-year experiment no one designed. The Hapcheon impact happened about 42,300 years ago. The lake that filled the crater persisted, in various forms, for something like 27,000 years before it was eventually sealed and buried by accumulating sediment and tectonic adjustments. 27,000 years is longer than the entire history of human agriculture. It is longer than the time since the last major glaciation began retreating. It is longer than the existence of any human civilization that has left written records. That lake, sitting in its asteroid wound, was an ongoing chemical experiment that ran for almost 3 times the length of recorded human history. After the impact, once the immediate fireball and shockwave had passed, and the molten rock at the crater floor began to cool, water started moving back into the wound from multiple sources. Groundwater, which had been driven away from the impact zone by the heat, began to seep back through the fractured rock around the crater. Rainfall fell into the bowl-shaped depression and accumulated. Surrounding streams, where they had been diverted or destroyed by the impact, gradually re-established themselves and contributed water as well. Within years to decades, depending on local conditions, there would have been a stable lake sitting where the wound used to be, and that lake had energy sources that ordinary lakes do not have. The deep crustal rock beneath the crater was still hot, and it would stay hot for thousands of years. Heat conducts slowly through stone. Even a modest melt sheet of a few hundred meters thickness, surrounded by rock that has been thermally affected by the impact, will take an extraordinary amount of time to fully equilibrate with the surrounding crust. Estimates for crater hydrothermal system lifetimes range from a few thousand years for small craters to hundreds of thousands of years for very large ones. Hapcheon, at 7 kilometers across, would have hosted active hydrothermal circulation for at least several thousand years, possibly much longer. So the lake had heat from below. It had fresh water from above. It had a fractured, permeable substrate that allowed water to circulate through hot rock and pick up dissolved minerals. It had a shoreline that experienced wet-dry cycling as lake levels rose and fell with seasonal and longer-term climate variations. It had ultraviolet radiation from sunlight reaching the upper layers of the water. It had a closed basin geometry that allowed dissolved compounds to concentrate over time, rather than being diluted away as they would be in an ocean. This combination of features is, almost point for point, what an origin of life researcher would design if you asked them to build a natural laboratory for prebiotic chemistry from scratch. And one of the most important features in that list, possibly the most important, is the wet-dry cycling. There is a model of the origin of life associated with the work of David Deamer and Bruce Damer, often called the Damer-Deamer hypothesis, or the hot spring hypothesis, which has been quietly building support over the last decade and a half. The core insight of this model is that one of the hardest steps in early biochemistry, the step of getting small molecules to link up into long chains, polymers, like the precursors of RNA and proteins, requires a specific kind of environmental cycling. In water, these reactions are thermodynamically unfavorable, because joining two small molecules into a larger one releases water as a byproduct, and adding water to a system that already has water in it pushes the reaction backward. But if you periodically dry the system out, you remove that water and the reactions can proceed forward. Then if you add water back, you get a chance for the resulting polymers to fold, interact, and start doing whatever it is they are going to do. Then dry again, then wet again. Cycle after cycle after cycle. In the laboratory, this kind of wet-dry cycling has been shown to produce surprisingly long polymers from small starting molecules, including molecules that look a lot like the building blocks of nucleic acids. This is a robust experimental result. Wet-dry cycling makes prebiotic polymerization work in a way that pure aqueous chemistry simply does not. Now, where in nature do you find wet-dry cycling at the kind of scale and frequency that prebiotic chemistry would need? Not at deep-sea vents, where everything stays underwater forever. Not on dry land, where water is mostly absent. You find it at the margins of hot springs, ponds, and lakes, especially in geothermally active regions, where the shoreline regularly oscillates between wet and dry, where mineral surfaces are exposed to alternating cycles of submersion and evaporation, where chemistry gets a chance to reset and try again with new starting conditions. A crater lake like Hapcheon, with its hydrothermal heat and its freshwater chemistry and its variable lake levels, is one of the best naturally occurring wet-dry cycling environments you can imagine. Not the only kind of environment that can do it, but a particularly potent one, because it also has the heat, the mineral diversity, the extraterrestrial material delivery, and the closed basin concentration mechanism. Essentially every feature that prebiotic chemistry seems to want is present in an impact crater lake and absent or weak at deep-sea vents. So when you look at Hapcheon and you think about what was happening there for those 27,000 years, what you're looking at is a natural prebiotic chemistry experiment that ran continuously on a planetary scale with no human supervision for a length of time that no human laboratory could ever match. It is as if the planet itself ran an unattended experiment in early biochemistry, in the dark, for 27 millennia, and we just now started reading the lab notebook And of course, Hapcheon is not the only crater that has done this. It is just the most recent and most well-preserved one we have looked at carefully. The early Earth, during the period when life was actually originating, would have had thousands of these systems, or tens of thousands, scattered across its surface, running their slow chemistry in parallel. Some would have been smaller and shorter lived. Some would have been much larger and ran for hundreds of thousands of years. Each one would have been a chance for the chemistry to find new combinations, new pathways, new possibilities. Each one would have been an experiment. The implication is hard to look away from. The origin of life on Earth may not have been a single event in a single place, the way a deep-sea vent model implicitly suggests. It may have been a recurring feature of an active planet, generated over and over again every time a sufficiently large impactor struck a body of water-rich crust. Earth may have started life multiple times in multiple craters, with most of those starts going extinct and only a few persisting long enough to leave descendants. We do not know. But the Hapcheon discovery is now whispering that this is at minimum a serious possibility. Which brings us finally to the part of the conversation that has been simmering under the surface this whole time. The argument over which model is right, the vent model versus the crater model. A theory war, conducted very politely, that has been quietly raging in the academic literature for years, and that just got a significant new exhibit added to one side of the debate. Part 7. The Deep Sea Vent Dogma. For about 5 decades, the dominant story about the origin of life on Earth has been a story about the deep ocean. It is a beautiful story, in many ways. It is the kind of story that scientists love to tell because it has a clean theoretical structure and a satisfying physical mechanism. The story goes something like this. On the early Earth, before there was any life, the bottom of the ocean was dotted with hydrothermal vents, where seawater seeped down through cracks in the seafloor, got heated by underlying volcanic rock, picked up dissolved minerals and gases, and rose back up through chimneys made of precipitated minerals. Around these chimneys, the hot mineral-rich vent fluid mixed with the cold ocean water, creating sharp gradients in temperature, pH, and chemistry. Those gradients, the argument goes, are essentially natural batteries. They store energy in the form of chemical and electrochemical potential differences across the chimney walls. The seminal version of this idea, championed for decades by the geochemist Michael Russell and colleagues, focuses specifically on alkaline hydrothermal vents, where the vent fluid is much more basic than the surrounding seawater. The result is a natural proton gradient across the chimney wall, similar in principle to the proton gradients that all living cells use today to power their metabolism. According to the alkaline vent hypothesis, life essentially co-opted this naturally occurring proton gradient, learned to harness it, and then learned to maintain its own version of it inside cell membranes once it broke free of the vent. It is a thermodynamically elegant idea. It explains, at a stroke, why all known life uses proton gradients to make energy. It connects the origin of life to the deep geophysics of the planet in a way that feels satisfying. It makes the origin of metabolism look like a slow, gradual, almost inevitable extension of pre-existing geochemistry, rather than a series of unlikely accidents. For many years, the alkaline vent model was, more or less, the default position in serious origin of life research. Textbooks adopted it. Documentaries dramatized it. Funding flowed to projects that aligned with it. But the model has problems, and the more carefully you look at it, the more those problems start to add up. The first problem is dilution. The ocean is enormous. Whatever organic chemistry is happening near a vent, the products of that chemistry get carried away by ocean currents and dispersed into a vast volume of water. Reaching the kinds of concentrations needed for the next step of biochemical assembly, where small molecules need to find each other and react, is genuinely hard in that environment. Some vent advocates argue that the chimney walls themselves provide concentration mechanisms, with porous mineral structures that trap molecules in microcompartments. That is plausible to a point, but it is asking the chimney to do a lot of work. The second problem is salt. Modern seawater is salty, and while early ocean salinity was probably different, it was still ionic. Salt and ions interfere with the kinds of reactions that build the first membranes and the first nucleic acid polymers. In particular, the formation of fatty acid membranes, which are widely considered to be the most plausible candidates for the first cell membranes, is strongly inhibited in salty water. The fatty acids precipitate out as solid soaps rather than self-assembling into the soft B-layer membranes that life would later refine into modern cell walls. Get fatty acids into fresh water, and they form membranes readily. Get them into seawater, and the experiment grinds to a halt. The third problem, related to the first two, is wet-dry cycling, or the lack of it. As we have already discussed, polymerization of nucleic acid building blocks into chains seems to need cycles of drying and re-wetting in order to proceed efficiently. Vents on the ocean floor offer no such cycling. They are continuously underwater. Whatever chemistry happens, there happens in solution, where the thermodynamics of polymerization push the wrong direction. The fourth problem is just instability. Many of the organic molecules that early life would have needed are unstable in hot water for long periods. Vents are hot, vents are wet. The combination is harsh on the very molecules the model is trying to produce. For each of these problems, defenders of the vent model have proposed solutions. Some involve specific kinds of mineral surfaces that catalyze reactions and protect intermediates. Some involve very specific geometries of chimney structures that create localized regions of low salt and concentrated organics. Some involve chains of vent activity in which different stages of life building happen in different sub-environments. These are all plausible patches, but the cumulative effect of needing so many patches has been, gradually, to soften the certainty around the vent model, and meanwhile, an alternative model has been growing in influence. A model that, until recently, sat at the edge of the conversation, treated as an interesting curiosity but not a serious challenger. Now with the Hapcheon discovery, it is starting to look less like a curiosity and more like a serious contender. To understand why, we need to go back and pick up the central thread of our story. If the textbooks have been pointing at the wrong ocean, then where exactly have they been failing to point? Part 8. The Crater Origin Hypothesis Rising. The alternative model has been associated, more than with anyone else, with the work of David Deamer at the University of California, Santa Cruz. Deamer is not a fringe figure. He is not someone working at the edges of the conversation, publishing papers that nobody reads. He has spent a long career, decades of it, studying the chemistry of how life might have assembled itself from nothing, and his conclusion has been consistently, quietly, stubbornly different from the mainstream. His focus has been less on deep-sea vents, and more on hot springs, geothermal pools, and similar surface or near-surface aqueous environments. Places where sunlight reaches, places where the water level rises and falls, places where chemistry gets a chance to concentrate, react, dry out, and try again. The model that bears his name, often credited together with his colleague Bruce Damer, and sometimes called the Damer-Deamer hypothesis, or simply the hot spring hypothesis, places the origin of life in shallow, hot freshwater pools, in volcanically or geothermally active regions, where wet-dry cycling, ultraviolet radiation, mineral-rich water, and atmospheric exchange could all combine to drive prebiotic chemistry forward in ways that the deep ocean simply cannot. It is a model built around the idea that life needed a very specific kind of restlessness to get started. Not the calm, continuous chemistry of a deep-sea vent. Something more like a tide pool that never quite settled. Something that kept shaking the chemistry loose and forcing it into new configurations. And this is where the crater origin hypothesis enters the picture. Because what the crater hypothesis does, in a sense, is take the Damer-Deamer model and extend it to a specific kind of environment that is not just capable of doing all of that, but extraordinarily good at it. Almost purpose-built for it, if you will forgive the teleological language. Impact craters do not just provide a hot freshwater pool. They provide a hot freshwater pool with a built-in delivery of extraterrestrial materials that arrived on the day of the impact itself. They provide a long-lived heat source baked directly into the bedrock. They provide a closed basin geometry that traps dissolved compounds and concentrates them over time rather than letting them bleed away into a wider body of water. And they provide a fractured rock substrate, all that cracked and shattered stone beneath the crater floor, that creates an almost incomprehensible amount of mineral surface area for chemistry to happen on. Surface area matters enormously in prebiotic chemistry. Reactions that would never occur between molecules floating freely in solution happen readily when those molecules are pressed against the right mineral surface. And a freshly impacted crater is essentially one enormous mineral surface, cracked and exposed and reactive and warm. Each of these features addresses directly one of the known problems with the deep-sea vent model: dilution. Crater lakes are closed basins. Whatever dissolves into the water stays in the water. Compounds accumulate rather than dispersing into the vastness of an open ocean. Salt? Crater lakes are freshwater, fed by rain and groundwater, which means the fatty acid chemistry that produces the first candidate cell membranes actually works. Put those fatty acids into seawater and they precipitate out as soap. Put them into fresh water and they spontaneously form the soft, flexible bilayer membranes that all life eventually refined into cell walls. Wet-dry cycling. Crater lake margins experience repeated cycles of submersion and exposure as the water level fluctuates with seasons, with dry years and wet years, with the slow breathing of a climate over centuries. The shoreline is never quite still. Stability of the organic molecules themselves. The hydrothermal heat is concentrated near the crater floor, deep enough that the surface waters and the shallow shoreline remain cool enough to preserve the fragile molecules that hot environments would otherwise destroy. You get the heat where you need it, and the calm where you need that. There is also a feature of crater lakes that deep-sea vents simply do not have, and it is one that I think often gets overlooked. That feature is environmental diversity within a very small area. Stand at the edge of a crater lake on the early Earth. Close your eyes for a second and actually try to picture this. And within a few hundred meters of where you are standing, you would have access to an entire spectrum of chemical microenvironments. Hot vent zones near the center of the lake, where hydrothermal fluids are actively pumping mineral-rich water up from the fractured rock below. Warm shallows where sunlight penetrates, and photosynthetic chemistry becomes at least conceivable if the right pigments ever stumble into existence. Cool deep zones where heat-sensitive molecules can stabilize without being cooked apart. Shoreline zones experiencing that all-important wet-dry cycling where the tide of the lake retreats in the dry season and leaves behind concentrated films of chemistry on exposed mineral surfaces. And mineral-rich precipitation zones where evaporation creates tiny pools of extraordinarily concentrated chemistry, natural little test tubes running their own experiments. All of this in one place. All of it exchanging material with all the rest of it, driven by water currents, wave action, the slow pulse of the hydrothermal system below. It is, if you think about it honestly, exactly the kind of environment in which the origin of life starts to look less like a miracle and more like something that might just happen, given enough time and enough tries. Different stages of the process could take place in different microenvironments, with material being continuously shuttled between them. The polymerization of small molecules into longer chains, one of the hardest steps in all of prebiotic chemistry, could happen at the wet-dry margin, where the drying concentrates the molecules and the thermodynamics finally tip in the right direction. Membrane self-assembly could happen in the cool shallows, where the fatty acids behave themselves. Catalysis on mineral surfaces could happen in the deeper zones, where specific minerals template specific reactions. Concentration and recombination could happen in the evaporating shoreline pools. The whole crater is, in essence, a distributed chemistry laboratory, with each part of the lake handling a different part of the problem, and I think this is the deepest insight at the heart of the crater origin hypothesis, the thing that makes it intellectually compelling, beyond just the chemistry, beyond just the list of features and how they map onto the list of problems. It is the recognition that life probably does not need stability to get started. That is a counterintuitive idea, because we associate life with stability. We associate it with homeostasis, with the careful regulation of internal conditions, with cells that go to extraordinary lengths to keep their interiors consistent even as the outside world changes. But that stability is something life achieved. It is not something life required in order to begin. The conditions that produced life in the first place may have been almost the opposite of stable. They may have been chaotic, oscillating, repeatedly disturbed, repeatedly reset. A system that kept shaking the chemistry loose, throwing molecules into new configurations, letting them settle for a while, then shaking them again. What life needed in this picture is not stability, but something more like guided instability. Cycles, change, a system that is dynamic enough to keep exploring chemical space, but constrained enough by the basin geometry, by the mineral surfaces, by the recurring rhythms of wet and dry, that it keeps exploring the same neighbourhood of chemical space over and over until something sticks. The vent model offers a stable, steady-state environment, continuous flow, consistent gradients, the same chemistry, day after day, for thousands of years. That is not nothing. Stability has its own virtues, and the vent model has genuine explanatory power for certain aspects of early biochemistry. But it does not offer cycles. It does not offer reset. It does not offer the kind of restless, iterative experimentation that the crater model provides in abundance. Increasingly, the experimental and observational evidence is nudging the field toward the dynamic model. Wet-dry cycling experiments in laboratories have produced surprisingly long polymer chains from simple starting molecules. Studies of crater lake chemistry have confirmed that these environments concentrate and diversify organic compounds in exactly the ways the hypothesis predicts. And the Hapcheon discovery, with its confirmed stromatolites, its blended earth and space chemistry, its long-lived hydrothermal history all locked inside a freshwater crater lake, is one of the strongest pieces of field evidence for the crater origin hypothesis to emerge in years, possibly ever. This does not mean the vent model is wrong. It does not mean we should close that chapter and move on. Science does not work that way, and this question is too important to be settled by a single discovery, however striking. What it means is that the conversation is genuinely opening up, that the textbooks may need more than a footnote update, that we need to look at impact craters with fundamentally different eyes than we have been using, not as scars on a planet's surface, not as destruction events to be catalogued and moved past, but as something almost opposite to all of that. Cradles, reactors, furnaces of possibility, places where the violence of an impact became, over thousands of years, the patience of chemistry finding its way. And once you start seeing craters that way, you start noticing something uncomfortable. Because the Hapcheon story is not alone. It never was. There are other craters, on Earth and elsewhere, that have been quietly telling versions of this same story for years. 3 of them in particular, when you put them side by side with Hapcheon, stop looking like isolated curiosities and start looking like a pattern that suggests what we found under that Korean rice field may not be an exception to how planets work. It may be exactly how they work. We just have not been looking. Part 9. The 3 craters that change the conversation. The first comparison is with Chicxulub, and if you know one impact crater by name, it is probably this one, even if you did not know it was a crater. Chicxulub is the buried impact structure off the Yucatan coast of Mexico, the scar left by the asteroid that ended the age of the dinosaurs 66 million years ago. It is famous. It is enormous, about 180 kilometers across, which means you could fit the entire state of Connecticut inside it, with room to spare. And the energy of that impact is so far beyond Hapcheon that the comparison almost stops being useful. We are talking about something on the order of 100 million megatons, where Hapcheon released roughly 1/3 of humanity's current nuclear arsenal in a single instant, Chicxulub released the equivalent of every nuclear weapon on Earth fired simultaneously, tens of thousands of times over. Almost all complex life over a certain body size went extinct. The world was plunged into years of darkness as dust and soot and sulfur aerosols blanketed the atmosphere and blocked out the sun. Ecosystems that had taken hundreds of millions of years to build collapsed in geological eye blinks. This is the crater everyone knows about, the extinction event, the end of one world. But here is the part that almost nobody talks about, and it is the part that is directly relevant to our story. After Chicxulub, after the fires and the darkness and the collapse, scientists drilling into the central peak ring of that crater, the raised ring of rock at the crater's centre, pushed up by the rebound of the impact, have found evidence of something extraordinary. A thriving microbial ecosystem, one that established itself in the post-impact hydrothermal system sometimes within just years to decades after the impact itself, not centuries, not millennia, years. The same event that sterilized the surface of the Earth across a significant fraction of the planet, that ended the reign of the non-avian dinosaurs, that reset the trajectory of life on this world, that same event, in the very wound it left behind, almost immediately became a home for life. Heated mineral-rich fluids circulating through the fractured peak ring rock. Microbial communities moving in before the dust had fully settled. The crater that ended one form of life on Earth became a habitat for another form of life so fast that, by geological standards, there was essentially no gap at all. This is now well documented. It is not a fringe claim. The Chicxulub Central Peak Ring is, and has been for tens of millions of years, essentially a microbial city. The active hydrothermal heat is long gone, but the legacy of that heat, the altered minerals, the porous fractured structure, the chemical fingerprints left by decades or centuries of hot fluid circulation, has continued to support microbial communities for an almost incomprehensible length of time. The ecosystem set up shop in the aftermath of the worst day in the history of complex life on Earth, and in some sense, it has never left. That is not a footnote. That is a headline. The most destructive impact in the last 100 million years was also, almost simultaneously, one of the most effective habitat creation events in the same period. The second comparison is smaller, quieter, and in some ways more instructive. Lonar Lake, in the Buldana district of Maharashtra in central India, is a crater lake formed by an impact estimated at somewhere between 40,000 and 70,000 years ago, depending on which dating method you trust. It is small, only about 1.5 kilometers across, which makes it a fraction of Hapcheon's 7 kilometers and essentially a pinprick compared to Chicxulub's 180. It is not dramatic to look at. It sits in a shallow depression surrounded by basalt plains, the lake itself dark and slightly alkaline, ringed by scrubby vegetation and the occasional temple. It does not look like a window into the origin of life. It looks like a lake. But Lonar has a property that has made it quietly famous in planetary science circles for years. The rock it formed in is basalt, dark, dense, iron-rich volcanic rock. And basalt is, importantly, very similar in composition to the rocks that cover most of the surface of Mars, which means Lonar Lake is, among other things, a natural laboratory for understanding what happens to microbial communities when they colonize an impact crater in basaltic terrain. It is, in other words, a preview of what we might find if we drill into the right Martian crater at the right depth. And what we find at Lonar is life, lots of it. The lake is alkaline and somewhat saline, which has produced its own specific and unusual community of organisms, extremophiles, essentially microbes that thrive in conditions that would kill most things. But within that community there are complex layered mat structures, microbial mats built up over time by successive generations of organisms, community upon community, layer upon layer. The water chemistry carries clear signatures of the original impact, mineral assemblages that only form under the specific conditions of hypervelocity, impact followed by hydrothermal alteration. The crater shaped the chemistry shaped the life, and the life has been there, quietly persisting for tens of thousands of years. Lonar is not a fluke. It is confirmation that this pattern, impact, hydrothermal system, microbial colonization, persistent ecosystem, does not require a special set of circumstances to occur. It just requires a crater, and some water, and some time. The third comparison takes us further back. The Kara crater system in northern Russia, situated on the Yugorsky Peninsula near the Kara Sea, is a much older and much larger impact site, formed somewhere around 70 million years ago during the late Cretaceous, roughly contemporaneous with the final years of the dinosaurs. It is deeply eroded, partially buried, and in some ways more ghost than crater. The sharp features have been worn away by tens of millions of years of Arctic weather and glaciation, and what remains is more a chemical signature in the rock than a recognizable bowl in the landscape. But that chemical signature is exactly what makes Kara interesting, and exactly what makes it relevant to our story. What Kara shows us is the long tail of an impact. The hydrothermal system that followed the impact has been cold for tens of millions of years. The lake, if there ever was one, is long gone. The active chemistry, by any conventional definition, is over. And yet the mineral assemblages produced by that original impact-driven hydrothermal circulation persist in the rock. They continue to influence the chemistry of any groundwater that passes through the fractured substrate. They continue to create microenvironments, tiny pockets of unusual chemistry embedded in otherwise ordinary Arctic geology that are distinct from anything the surrounding rock would produce on its own. The crater is not a brief chemical event followed by a return to baseline. It is a permanent modification, a restructuring of the local geology that continues to have chemical consequences for tens or hundreds of millions of years after the impact itself. This is a subtle but important point. When we talk about impact craters as chemical reactors, it is tempting to think of them as temporary. The asteroid hits, the hydrothermal system runs for a few thousand or a few 100,000 years, it cools down, and the crater goes back to being just a hole in the ground. But Kara says otherwise. The hole in the ground is never quite just a hole. The impact leaves fingerprints in the rock that outlast everything else about the event. Long after the heat is gone and the lake is gone and the ecosystem, if there was one, is gone, the chemistry is still there, still subtly different, still doing things that unimpacted rock would not do. Now put all four of these together. Hapcheon, 42,000 years old, 7 kilometers across, freshwater crater lake, stromatolites, blended earth and space chemistry, hydrothermal fingerprints, active ecosystem preserved in drilling cores pulled up in 2026. Chicxulub, 66 million years old, 180 kilometers across, microbial city in the Peak Ring, ecosystem established within years of the most catastrophic impact of the last 100 million years. Lonar, between 40 and 70,000 years old, 1.5 kilometers across, basaltic terrain mirroring the composition of Mars, thriving microbial mats, impact chemistry still shaping the water to this day. Kara, 70 million years old, deeply eroded hydrothermal system long dead, but chemical legacy still restructuring the local geology after all this time. What you're looking at, when you line them up, is not a series of isolated curiosities. It is a pattern, a reliable, repeating, cross-scale pattern that holds across craters of wildly different sizes and ages, and geological settings and climatic contexts. Impacts generate habitable chemistry windows. Those windows open fast, sometimes within years of the impact itself. They stay open for a long time, thousands to hundreds of thousands of years, for the active hydrothermal phase. And the chemical legacy of those windows persists for orders of magnitude longer still, tens to hundreds of millions of years in the rock record. And microbial life, wherever it already exists, colonizes these windows quickly and reliably. This pattern has started to acquire a name in the literature. People are beginning to call it the impact habitability cycle. The basic idea is straightforward once you see it. On a planet like Earth, with a steady enough supply of impactors and a sufficient abundance of water, the planet does not just passively host microbial life. It actively resets microbial habitats on a regular basis through impact events. Each impact creates a new wound. Each wound generates a new hydrothermal system. Each hydrothermal system creates a new habitat window. Life moves in, time passes, the system cools, the sediments fill in, the active phase ends. And then, somewhere else on the planet, another rock falls out of the sky, and the whole cycle starts again. If this is the right framework, and the evidence is increasingly pointing in that direction, then impacts are not the disruptions to Earth's biological story that we have always cast them as. They are part of the machinery, part of the clockwork, part of how a water-rich, geologically active planet with a steady supply of cosmic traffic maintains and renews its microbial ecosystems over geological time. And now take that framework and wind the clock backward. Back to the early Earth, before there was any established biosphere to disrupt or renew. Back to a time when impacts were not occasional events, but effectively continuous features of the planetary environment, with large impactors arriving every few thousand years somewhere on the surface. In that world, the impact habitability cycle would not have been renewing existing ecosystems. It would have been generating fresh chemical environments over and over, in which prebiotic chemistry could take another run at that final, stubborn, seemingly impossible step, the step from complex chemistry to actual biology. The crater origin hypothesis, in its most ambitious form, does not say that life started once in one crater and then spread. It says life may have started many times, in many craters, on many parts of the early Earth simultaneously, each experiment running in its own freshwater bowl, with its own blend of chemistry, its own hydrothermal heat signature, its own delivery of extraterrestrial material. Most of those experiments failed. The chemistry ran its course, the lake cooled, the crater filled with sediment, and whatever was assembling itself in that particular bowl was lost before it could cross the threshold. But some experiments ran longer. Some craters were bigger, with hydrothermal systems that lasted hundreds of thousands of years rather than tens of thousands. Some had better chemistry, richer mineral diversity, more favourable wet-dry cycling. And in one of them, or a handful of them, something crossed the threshold. Something became self-replicating. Something became, however improbably, alive, and then it escaped. It spread from the crater into the wider water table, into rivers, into the ocean, across the surface of the planet. It diversified. It adapted. It eventually became everything. Every cell in every body alive today, yours included, is a descendant of that escape, of that one successful experiment out of possibly thousands of failed ones that happened to run long enough and get lucky enough to make it out of its crater before the clock ran out. That is a humbling picture. You are, on this telling, the great-great-grandchild of a chemical accident in a hole in the ground. But it is also a generative picture. Because if this is how Earth works, if this is just what happens when you take a water-rich rocky planet and let the solar system throw rocks at it for a few 100 million years, then it is not a uniquely Earth thing. It is a planetary thing, a universal process, which means every other world out there that has been hit by enough rocks while holding enough water has been running the same experiment. And some of them, somewhere out there, may have gotten the same result, which means it is time to leave Earth. Part 10. Mars, a planet full of hidden Hapcheons. If impact craters with hydrothermal lake systems are the cradles of life, and the evidence is increasingly suggesting that they might be, then there is one place in our solar system that we should be looking at very carefully right now. Not Europa, not Enceladus, not the deep ocean of some distant icy moon. A place much closer, a place we have been sending robots to for 50 years, a place we have been photographing and analysing and arguing about for longer than most of the people watching this have been alive. A place that is, in geological terms, older than Earth in some senses, that was warmer and wetter than it is now during its early history, and that is, if you look at it honestly, essentially nothing but craters from one end to the other. Mars. Let's just sit with that for a second, because I think Mars has become so familiar as a concept, the red planet, the neighbour, the destination, that we sometimes forget how extraordinary its surface actually is. The surface of Mars is, in geological terms, a museum, a perfectly preserved, extraordinarily detailed museum of impact events stretching back billions of years. And the reason it is so well preserved is precisely because Mars lacks the things that erase craters on Earth. No active plate tectonics grinding and recycling the crust. No substantial rainfall weathering the rock face down into soil and sediment over millions of years. No dense forest of roots and organisms breaking down the surface and burying everything underneath biological activity. Mars just keeps things. It holds on to its history in a way that Earth fundamentally cannot. Craters on Mars that are 3 billion years old are still there, still recognizable in satellite imagery, still mappable, still waiting to be investigated. The impact history of Mars is written on its face in permanent ink. The number of confirmed impact craters on Mars runs into the hundreds of thousands, ranging from tiny pits a few meters across to enormous ancient basins, thousands of kilometers wide that predate almost everything else in the solar system's history. Mars is, in a very real sense, the most cratered large body in the inner solar system that we have detailed access to, and every one of those craters is a data point. Every one of them is a record of a moment when a rock fell out of the sky and the planet responded. Now add water. Because here is the thing about early Mars that changes everything. Between roughly 4.5 and 3.5 billion years ago, during the period when life was either beginning or already underway on Earth, Mars was a genuinely different world from the frozen desert we see today. It had a thicker atmosphere. It had a functioning hydrological cycle. It had liquid water on its surface, not just briefly, not just in isolated pockets, but persistently, over geological timescales long enough to carve river valleys and fill crater basins and deposit the kind of layered sedimentary sequences that take standing water and a long time to produce. We know all of this not from guesswork, but from evidence. Ancient river channels carved into the Martian highlands, unmistakable in their morphology, their branching patterns, their downstream widening. Sedimentary rocks laid down in the quiet water of ancient lakes, their layers as legible as pages. Mineral assemblages, clays, carbonates, sulfates, that only form in the sustained presence of liquid water, and that are scattered across the Martian surface in quantities that speak to a planet that was once genuinely wet. Early Mars was, by many reasonable measures, more Earth-like than it is now. Not identical to Earth, not a twin, but recognizably in the same family of worlds, rocky, warm enough for liquid water, atmospheric enough to slow the evaporation, geologically active enough to keep the chemistry interesting. And early Mars was getting hit. Constantly. The same late heavy bombardment that was peppering the early Earth with impactors was doing the same thing to Mars, and Mars, being closer to the asteroid belt and lacking Earth's relatively large moon to help sweep the orbital neighbourhood, may have been getting hit even harder. Every one of those impacts landing on a wet and warm and atmospheric Mars would have done exactly what the Hapcheon impact did on Earth. It would have excavated a crater. The crater would have filled with water from the surrounding water table, from rainfall, from the slow seepage of groundwater back into the wound. The hot, shattered rock beneath the crater floor would have driven hydrothermal circulation for thousands to hundreds of thousands of years. The lake margins would have experienced wet-dry cycling as the water level fluctuated with the Martian seasons and the longer-term climate variations. The local chemistry would have been a blend of Martian crustal minerals and delivered extraterrestrial material, the same fusion of Earth-born and space-born chemistry that we just found preserved in the Hapcheon Stromatolites. Each of those Martian crater lakes would have been, in principle, exactly what the crater origin hypothesis says you need: a closed freshwater basin, hydrothermal heat from below, mineral-rich fluids cycling through fractured rock, wet-dry cycling at the shoreline, concentrated chemistry in a contained environment, extraterrestrial material delivered fresh on the day of the impact, running for tens of thousands of years, on Mars, billions of years ago. This is not wild speculation. This is the geology talking, and the geology is very loud on this point if you know how to listen to it. NASA's Perseverance rover has been listening since it landed in February 2021. Perseverance is sitting right now, and I mean right now, as you watch this, inside Jezero crater, a roughly 45-kilometer wide impact basin formed about 3.9 billion years ago on the western edge of Isidis Planitia. Jezero hosted a lake. We know this with high confidence. The evidence is sitting there on the surface for anyone to see in the orbital imagery, a beautifully preserved river delta on the western side of the crater, where a long-vanished river once flowed down from the surrounding highlands, slowed as it entered the lake, and dropped its sediment load in the classic fan shape that river deltas make everywhere in the solar system, where rivers meet standing water. Those deltic sediments have been accumulating in that crater for billions of years. They are exactly the kind of geological archive where, if microbial life ever existed in that lake, the chemical and structural evidence of that life would be most likely to survive. Perseverance is collecting samples from those sediments, carefully, systematically. Core by core, sample tube by sample tube, building up a library of Martian geology that will eventually, in a future sample return mission currently being planned by NASA and ESA, come back to Earth for the kind of detailed laboratory analysis that no rover instrument, however sophisticated, can fully replicate. The scientists will get those samples into terrestrial labs with mass spectrometers and electron microscopes and isotope ratio analyzers and every other tool in the modern analytical arsenal, and they will look for biosignatures. For chemistry that life produces and geology alone does not. For structures that organisms build and abiotic processes do not. For the same kinds of signals, in other words, that the Korean team found in the Hapcheon drilling cores. That mission is, whether anyone frames it in exactly these terms or not, a direct test of the crater origin hypothesis applied to Mars. If the hypothesis is right, and if life ever got started on Mars during the wet early period, then Jezero is among the most probable places in the solar system to find evidence of it. Not because it is special in some unique way, but because it is a crater that hosted a lake, and crater lakes that hosted water are exactly where the hypothesis predicts the chemistry would have been most favourable for life to begin. Jezero is not alone in this. Ritchie Crater, in the southern highlands of Mars, shows spectroscopic signatures of clay minerals and sulfate deposits that are most straightforwardly explained by post-impact hydrothermal alteration, hot water cycling through fractured impact rock and leaving its mineral fingerprints behind. Similar signatures appear at dozens of other craters distributed across the Martian surface. Columbus Crater, McLaughlin Crater, Eberswalde, a growing catalogue of impact structures that show the chemical hallmarks of having hosted hydrothermal water systems in their post-impact history. This is not a Jezero story, it is a Mars story, a planet-wide pattern of crater-hosted hydrothermal windows, dating from the same wet early period when the crater origin hypothesis says life could have begun. Now let the scale of that sink in. If Earth had thousands of these impact hydrothermal systems running simultaneously during the period when life was originating here, and the early Earth impact rate suggests it probably did, then Mars had thousands too, maybe tens of thousands, given its cratered surface and its wet early history. Each one a window, each one a chemistry experiment running in its own closed basin, with its own mineral profile, its own heat source, its own blend of Martian and extraterrestrial material. Each one a chance, a possible start, a possible first page of a biological story that may or may not have had time to get to the second page before the climate shifted and the water disappeared and the window closed. The fact that Mars is now cold and dry and apparently lifeless does not tell us that those windows never opened. It only tells us that, if life did start in one of those craters, it either went extinct when conditions deteriorated, or it retreated, underground, into the deep subsurface where liquid water may still exist in pockets, kept liquid by geothermal heat, hidden from the radiation and the cold of the Martian surface. Life that started in a crater lake 3.5 billion years ago could, in principle, have found its way down, could still be there, dormant, slow, surviving in the margins of a dying world. We have no evidence of that, but we also have no evidence against it. Mars has not been drilled deeply enough, in the right places, to give us a definitive answer. What the Hapcheon discovery has done, in a very practical sense, is sharpen our picture of what we are looking for and why we are looking for it there. Before Hapcheon, the crater lake strategy for Mars was theoretically motivated. It made sense on paper, based on what we knew about impact hydrothermal systems and prebiotic chemistry. After Hapcheon, it is empirically motivated. We now have direct observational evidence, pulled out of the ground of our own planet, that impact crater lakes actually do host microbial ecosystems, that those ecosystems actually do build biological structures, stromatolites, that preserve themselves in the sediment record over tens of thousands of years, that the chemical signature of those systems, the blended hydrothermal and extraterrestrial chemistry, is detectable in those structures after all that time. We know what the signal looks like. We know what to search for. We know it can survive long enough to be found. If the Jezero samples come back to Earth, and the laboratory teams find stromatolite-like structures in the deltic sediments, layered biological architecture, biosignature chemistry, the same kind of signal the Korean team pulled out of Hapcheon, that will be the most consequential scientific discovery in the history of our species. Bar none. The confirmation of life beyond Earth. The answer to the question humanity has been asking in one form or another for as long as we have been asking questions. And when that day comes, if it comes, the Hapcheon discovery will be seen as the moment the search got serious, the moment we stopped guessing at what Martian life might look like and started knowing, the moment a Korean rice field gave us the map. But Mars is only the beginning of where this line of thinking leads, because the crater origin hypothesis does not stop at Mars. It applies in principle to any world that has been hit by enough rocks while holding enough water, and there are other worlds in this solar system where the picture gets considerably more complicated, worlds where the surface conditions are nothing like Hapcheon, where the chemistry is alien, where the rules we have been building our search strategies around may not quite apply. Worlds that force us to ask a question we have been quietly avoiding. The question of whether habitability and the origin of life are actually the same thing, or whether they are two completely different problems with two completely different answers. It is time to talk about the icy moons. Part 11. Icy worlds and the missing ingredient problem. In the outer solar system, far from the warmth of the sun, there are several worlds that scientists currently consider among the most promising candidates for finding life beyond Earth. And I want to be careful about how I phrase that, because the word promising is doing a lot of work in that sentence, and the Hapcheon discovery has started to put some pressure on exactly what we mean by it. Most of these worlds are not planets in the traditional sense. They are moons, large moons of the giant planets, Jupiter and Saturn, with surfaces of ice and vast oceans of liquid water hidden underneath, kept from freezing by heat sources that have nothing to do with the sun. The two most famous, the two that come up in almost every conversation about life in the outer solar system, are Europa and Enceladus. Europa is roughly the size of our own moon, which is to say it is not small. But its surface is something our moon's surface is not, a sheet of water ice, kilometers thick, cracked and refrozen and cracked again by the enormous tidal forces that Jupiter exerts on it during every orbit. Underneath that ice sheet, maintained in its liquid state by the heat generated by all that constant gravitational flexing, is a global ocean, not a regional sea, not a subsurface lake, a planet-wide ocean of liquid water, estimated to contain roughly twice the volume of all of Earth's oceans combined, sitting in the dark beneath kilometers of ice. And at the bottom of that ocean, where the water meets the rocky core of the moon, there may be hydrothermal vents, hot mineral-rich fluid rising from the seafloor, energy gradients, active chemistry. the same basic setup that the deep-sea vent model places at the origin of life on Earth. Enceladus is much smaller. You could fit it comfortably inside the borders of France, but in some ways it is the more immediately compelling object because it is not being coy about what it is doing. Enceladus is actively venting. From a series of cracks near its south pole nicknamed the Tiger Stripes, the Moon is continuously ejecting plumes of water vapour and ice particles directly into space. These plumes are so dramatic that the Cassini spacecraft, which spent 13 years orbiting Saturn, was able to fly directly through them multiple times and analyse their composition in real time. What Cassini found was not just water, it found salts, organic compounds, silica particles that form only at specific high temperatures, suggesting active hydrothermal chemistry at the ocean floor. And hydrogen, molecular hydrogen, which is a chemical marker of water reacting with hot rock in a process called serpentinization, the same kind of reaction that powers alkaline hydrothermal vents on Earth. Enceladus is, in a very literal sense, advertising its subsurface ocean to anyone in the neighbourhood with a mass spectrometer. These are extraordinary places. When you list their properties, liquid water, internal heat, active chemistry, organic compounds, they check almost every box on the standard habitability checklist. And if you are working from the deep-sea vent model of the origin of life, they look almost ideal. Vents on the ocean floor, energy gradients between hot fluid and cold water, mineral-rich chemistry in a liquid water environment. The vent model was essentially built around this kind of setting, and Europa and Enceladus are, in a sense, the vent model's dream candidates. They are why so many astrobiologists have spent so many years arguing for missions to the outer solar system. They are why Europa Clipper, NASA's spacecraft currently en route to Jupiter, is one of the most anticipated planetary science missions of this decade. And all of that excitement is legitimate. These are real oceans. The chemistry is real. The heat is real. If the vent model is right, these worlds deserve every bit of the attention they are getting. But here is where the Hapcheon discovery starts to pull the thread in an uncomfortable direction. If the crater origin hypothesis is right, if what the Korean drilling cores are telling us is that life does not just need liquid water and heat, but specifically needs the dynamic, cycling, surface-exposed, impact-generated chemistry that a crater lake provides, then Europa and Enceladus are missing something. Something fundamental. Something that no amount of subsurface ocean depth or hydrothermal vent activity can substitute for. They have no surface, not in any meaningful chemical sense. Their oceans are buried under ice, completely isolated from sunlight, from the atmosphere, from the wet-dry cycling that the Dame-Edema hypothesis identifies as one of the most critical drivers of prebiotic polymerization. There is no shoreline on Europa where the water retreats in the dry season and leaves behind concentrated films of organic chemistry on exposed mineral surfaces, because there is no dry season, because there is no surface, because there is no sun reaching the water at all. There is no ultraviolet radiation driving photochemistry in the upper layers of the ocean, because the upper layers of the ocean are ice. There is no atmosphere-water interface where gases and organics can exchange and react, because the atmosphere, such as it is separated from the water by kilometers of frozen crust. The crater origin hypothesis does not say these worlds are dead. It does not say life cannot exist in a subsurface ocean. What it says is something more precise and in some ways more troubling for how we have been prioritizing our search. It says that the conditions required to start life, to take non-living chemistry and push it across the threshold into self-replicating biology, are probably not the same as the conditions required to maintain life once it already exists. And the conditions required to start life, if Hapcheon is any guide, look a lot more like a surface crater lake than a deep buried ocean. There is a word for this distinction that the field is starting to use more carefully: habitability. We talk constantly about habitability. Is this world habitable? Does this environment meet the criteria for habitability? Could life survive here? And the answer for Europa and Enceladus, by most reasonable definitions of habitability, is probably yes. Liquid water, check. Energy source, check. Organic chemistry, check. These worlds are plausibly habitable, but habitability and origin of life are not the same question. They are not even the same category of question. Habitability asks, could life survive here if it were present? Origin of life asks, could life have begun here from scratch? An environment can be perfectly habitable and still be completely incapable of generating life from non-life. The deep ocean of Earth today is teeming with life and is, by any measure, highly habitable. But it may not have been where life started. The ocean is full of descendants of life that began somewhere else. Habitability and genesis are different things. This distinction matters enormously for how we prioritize the search. If you're asking where life might exist right now, in some form, anywhere in the solar system, then Europa and Enceladus are reasonable places to look. If life somehow got started there, perhaps seeded from somewhere else, perhaps through some pathway we have not yet imagined, their oceans could sustain it. But if you're asking where life is most likely to have actually originated, to have taken that first impossible step from chemistry to biology without any help, then the crater origin hypothesis points you somewhere very different. It points you to worlds with surfaces, with atmospheres, with impact histories, with crater lakes that experienced wet and dry and hot and cool and light and dark, cycling through those conditions over and over for thousands of years until the chemistry finally found its way. It points you, in other words, away from the icy moons and back toward the rocky worlds, back toward Mars, back toward Earth, back toward the kind of terrain that looks, from orbit, like a scarred and battered mess, but looks, from the right scientific perspective, like a laboratory. And then there is Titan, Saturn's largest moon, and honestly one of the strangest objects in the solar system. Titan has a thick atmosphere, thicker than Earth's, in terms of surface pressure. It has weather, it has seasons, it has river channels and lake basins and a global cycle of evaporation and precipitation, all of which sounds enormously Earth-like until you find out what the liquid is. Not water, methane. Liquid methane and ethane, hydrocarbons that exist as gases on Earth, but are liquid at Titan's surface temperature of around minus 179 degrees Celsius. Titan's lakes are filled with liquid natural gas. Its rain is liquid natural gas. Its rivers carry liquid natural gas down from the highlands into the lowland seas. The organic chemistry on Titan is genuinely extraordinary. The atmosphere is thick with complex carbon-based molecules, tholins, nitriles, hydrocarbons of increasing complexity, produced by the action of sunlight and energetic particles on the methane-nitrogen atmosphere. These molecules rain down onto the surface constantly, building up layers of organic sediment that in some regions may be hundreds of meters thick. In terms of raw organic chemical complexity, Titan's surface may be one of the richest environments in the solar system outside of Earth. The ingredients are there, in abundance. The chemistry is happening continuously and at scale, but it is happening in methane, and methane is not water. The chemistry of life as we know it, every enzyme, every membrane, every nucleic acid, is built around the specific properties of water as a solvent. Water is polar. It forms hydrogen bonds. It creates the hydrophobic effect that drives membranes to self-assemble. It dissolves the right things and repels the right things in exactly the way that biological chemistry requires. Methane does none of these things. It is non-polar. It dissolves different molecules. It creates different interactions. Whatever chemistry is possible in liquid methane is, by necessity, a completely different kind of chemistry from anything life on Earth uses. Whether that different chemistry could ever, under any circumstances, produce something we would recognize as life is a question that is genuinely, honestly, completely open. We do not know. We do not have a good theoretical framework for even approaching the question. Titan is a world where our existing models of life and habitability and the origin of biology essentially stop working, and we are left staring at a deeply alien environment and admitting, with appropriate humility, that we do not know what we are looking at. What Titan and Europa and Enceladus together force us to do is something that science does not always do gracefully. They force us to separate our questions, to stop treating the search for life as a single unified project with a single unified strategy, and to start treating it as at least two distinct projects that may need different approaches, different targets, different criteria for success. Project 1. Where did life originate? What kind of environment can take raw chemistry and push it across the threshold into biology? The crater origin hypothesis gives a clear answer to this question, and that answer points toward rocky, cratered, water-rich worlds with surface dynamics and impact histories. Mars, early Earth. Possibly other rocky worlds in other solar systems that we cannot yet resolve in detail. Project 2. Where might life exist right now, whether or not it originated there? This question has a broader answer. Anywhere with liquid water and an energy source is at least worth considering. Europa, Enceladus, possibly the deep subsurface of Mars, possibly in some form we cannot currently imagine Titan. These are different questions. They deserve different missions, different instruments, different scientific frameworks, and one of the most important things that Hapcheon has given us is the clarity to see that distinction more sharply than we did before. Because what Hapcheon has given us is not just evidence for a particular model of life's origin, it has given us a template, a concrete, physically real, geologically documented example of what an origin of a life environment looks like, preserved in rock, recoverable by drilling, readable by the tools we already have. We know what the signal looks like. We know what to search for. We know now the difference between a world that could host life and a world that could have started it. And the answer to that question, the honest, evidence-based, Hapcheon-informed answer, is that the icy moons, for all their wonder and all their liquid water and all their hydrothermal heat, are probably not where life began. They may be where life is hiding. They may be the refuge of something that started somewhere else and found its way into the dark, but the cradle, the actual chemical biological cradle, was probably somewhere that looked a lot more like a Korean rice field than an ocean buried under ice. The case is not closed. The crater origin hypothesis still needs more evidence, more craters drilled, more chemistry analysed, more comparisons built up layer by careful layer. But the furniture of the conversation has moved, the default has shifted, and the next decade of planetary exploration, Perseverance, Europa Clipper, Dragonfly heading to Titan, and whatever sample return missions eventually follow, will be, in a very real sense, a test of which picture of the universe is correct. We are, right now, at the beginning of finding out. Part 12. The final reframe. So let us go back, one more time, to that quiet rice field in South Korea. Picture it again. The flooded paddies reflecting whatever the sky is doing that morning, grey and overcast or sharp blue, or hazy with the kind of warmth that sits over agricultural lowlands in the late summer. The narrow earthen paths between the paddies, just wide enough for one person walking carefully. The mechanical pump somewhere in the distance, churning slowly, moving water from one place to another, the way it has been moved in this valley for centuries. A farmer walking the path, checking the irrigation gates, thinking about the things farmers think about, water levels, weather forecasts, the price of rice, whether the pump needs servicing again. He is not thinking about asteroids. He is not thinking about the origin of life. He has a farm to run. He has no idea what is under his feet. Most people do not. Most people who live on or near an impact crater go their entire lives without knowing it. And this is not because they are incurious or uninformed. It is because the Earth is extraordinarily good at hiding its own history. The wounds heal, the topography softens, the rivers reroute themselves around the new geography, and then, over thousands of years, sand it all down into something that looks like it was always just a valley, always just a basin, always just a low place where water collects and rice grows and people build their lives. The story buries itself under the weight of ordinary time. But the story is there. It has always been there. 42,300 years ago, on what would have been an otherwise unremarkable day in the late Pleistocene, a rock 200 meters wide arrived from somewhere in the solar system at somewhere between 15 and 20 kilometers per second, and it hit this valley with the energy of about 30 tsar bombas, firing simultaneously in a single point. The wound it made was 7 kilometers across. The rock beneath the impact point ceased to exist as solid matter in the first fraction of a second, converted to plasma and vapor, and a shock wave that flattened the surrounding landscape for tens of kilometers in every direction. Then gravity pulled everything back toward the wound. The fractured rock slumped inward. The central mass rebounded upward in the classic rebound architecture of a complex crater, and slowly, over years, decades, centuries, water began to seep back into the basin. And the chemistry of that water was unlike the chemistry of any other water in the region. It mixed what was already in the Earth's crust with what the asteroid had brought from somewhere beyond this world. Hydrothermal heat from the cooling melt rock below drove mineral-rich fluids upward through the fractured substrate. Meteoritic metal dissolved into the lake water and became part of the local chemistry. Europium anomalies built up in the sediment, fingerprints of hot circulating fluid. Osmium isotope ratios shifted toward extraterrestrial signatures, fingerprints of the asteroid itself, now dissolved and distributed through the ecosystem. Earth chemistry and space chemistry, woven together in proportions that no ordinary geological process produces and no other natural environment on this planet replicates. For 27,000 years, longer than all of recorded human history, longer than the oldest writing system, longer than the oldest city, longer than agriculture itself, that lake ran its slow chemical experiment. And at some point during those millennia, microbial communities found the lake margin and recognized it, in whatever chemical sense microbes recognize anything, as home. They set up shop in the shallow sunlit zone where the water met the rock. They secreted their sticky films. They trapped the sediment that drifted down through the water column. They grew upward toward the light through each new layer of trapped material, generation by generation, season by season, year by year, building the layered structures that we call stromatolites, recording the chemistry of their world in stone, the way life has always recorded itself, not in language, not in memory, but in the slow accumulation of physical structure over time. Then the lake closed. The hydrothermal heat finally dissipated, the last of it bleeding away into the surrounding crust over thousands of years. The water level dropped, the sediments accumulated, the basin filled in. The story sank beneath what would eventually become paddies and irrigation channels and the ordinary geography of a Korean agricultural valley. And it slept there, 42,000 years of sleep, while above it the world changed beyond recognition. Ice ages came and went. Megafauna went extinct. Homo sapiens domesticated animals and plants, and built cities and wrote books and launched rockets, and developed, eventually, the specific combination of scientific tools and intellectual curiosity needed to look at an unusually circular valley and start asking uncomfortable questions about why it was circular. Until 2020, when the confirmation came that it was a crater. Until 2026, when the drilling cores came up and the team looked at what was inside them and went very, very quiet for a moment before the implications started to land. Stromatolites, chemistry that fused hydrothermal heat with meteoritic metal. The layered autobiography of a microbial ecosystem that had built itself inside an asteroid wound and recorded 27,000 years of its own existence in the sediment. And underneath all of it, underneath the confirmed biology and the confirmed chemistry and the confirmed geology, a possibility so large and so strange that the researchers were careful, in their published paper, to frame it as a question rather than a conclusion. The possibility that what they were looking at was not just a curious local environment, not just an interesting footnote in the geology of the Korean peninsula, but a glimpse, a small, preserved, recoverable glimpse of how life on this planet may have actually started. Not at the bottom of the ocean, not in the cold dark around an alkaline vent, in steady-state chemistry that never dries out and never sees the sun and never gets shaken loose by a new delivery of material from space, but here, in places like this, in dynamic, cycling, impact-generated freshwater lakes, with extraterrestrial material arriving on the day the wound was made, with hot rock fueling the chemistry from below, with sunlight and wet-dry cycles and seasonal fluctuations and the slow concentration of dissolved compounds, working the chemistry from above and from the sides and from every direction at once. And with all of this extraordinary chemical machinery, running not just here but in thousands of craters on different parts of the early Earth, every time another rock fell out of the young solar system's crowded sky. If that is the right story, and I want to be honest with you, we do not know yet if it is, the evidence is compelling and growing, but the case is not closed, then it changes something fundamental about how we understand violence, cosmic violence specifically. We have always understood the bombardment of the early Earth as a problem, as a series of setbacks, as the universe trying, repeatedly, to undo whatever fragile progress chemistry had made toward biology. And some of those impacts were certainly devastating enough to set everything back. The largest ones would have boiled the oceans. Nothing could have survived that. But the medium ones, the ones like Hapcheon, 200 meters wide, a few kilometers of crater, a hydrothermal system that ran for thousands of years, and then handed off to a stable freshwater lake that ran for tens of thousands more. Those impacts were not setbacks, they were resets. They were the universe clearing a patch of ground and saying, here, try again, here is fresh chemistry, here is a closed basin, here is heat from below and light from above, and a delivery of new material from space. See what you can do with it. The wounds from space may not have been obstacles to the origin of life. They may have been the mechanism, the wombs that life crawled out of, again and again, until one of those attempts finally produced something robust enough to escape its crater and spread. I find this idea genuinely moving, in a way that is hard to articulate without sounding like I am reaching for poetry in a science video. But bear with me for a second, because I think it matters. The traditional picture of the origin of life is, at its heart, a picture of fragility finding shelter, of chemistry somehow surviving long enough in some protected corner of the early Earth to pull off the improbable trick of becoming biology. The deep-sea vent model is, emotionally speaking, a story about refuge, about life beginning in the most protected, most stable, most removed from danger environment available, the deep, cold dark where nothing disturbs the gradient, where the chemistry flows on in its quiet, steady way. The crater origin hypothesis is a completely different emotional story. It is a story about life not finding shelter from the violence, but being generated by it. Not surviving the bombardment despite the odds, but riding the bombardment as a creative force. Every impact a reset, every wound a reactor, every lake a new attempt. The early Earth not as a hostile environment that life had to overcome, but as an extraordinarily productive chemistry engine that kept making new opportunities, over and over, in a kind of patient cosmic trial and error that ran for hundreds of millions of years until something finally worked. This does not mean the vent model is wrong. I want to be clear about that because it would be easy to come away from this story with the impression that the science has moved firmly in one direction and the textbooks need to be thrown out. That is not quite the picture. The vent model has genuine explanatory power. There are aspects of early biochemistry, the origin of the proton gradient that all living cells use to make energy, for instance, that the vent model explains elegantly and that the crater model does not yet address with equal clarity. The conversation is not over. The crater origin hypothesis is a serious challenger, not a confirmed replacement. What Hapcheon has done is move it from the margins to the centre of the debate. The furniture has shifted. The default has been questioned in a way that will be very difficult to quietly put back in the old arrangement. It is also, if you step back far enough, a humbling reminder of how early we are in the process of understanding our own planet. Hapcheon was hiding under rice fields until 2020. The stromatolites inside it were recovered in 2026. Both of those dates are within the lifetimes of most of the people watching this video right now. Earth is still keeping secrets. Deep ones. Foundational ones. The science of where we came from is, despite 150 years of sustained effort since Darwin published his theory and set the whole project in motion, still genuinely unsettled at its most fundamental level. We do not know, with confidence, where on this planet life began. We do not know when, exactly. We do not know which chemical pathway crossed the threshold first. We have hypotheses, we have evidence, we have increasingly sophisticated models, but we do not have the answer. And the fact that one of the most important clues to that answer was sitting in a Korean valley, under the feet of a farmer checking his irrigation gates, waiting patiently for 42,000 years for someone to drill in the right spot is, I think, the most extraordinary part of this entire story. The biggest answers to the biggest questions are not always found in the places we think to look. They are not always in the deep ocean, or the remotest corners of the planet, or the most sophisticated laboratories. Sometimes they are in the most ordinary-looking places imaginable. Sometimes they are hidden by the very ordinariness of the world that grew up around them. Sometimes the planet is keeping its most important secrets under rice fields. When I look at a map of the Earth now, after following this story as far as I have followed it, I do not see the same map I used to see. I still see the countries and the cities and the mountain ranges and the ocean basins. But underneath all of that, I now see a different layer. I see a planet whose violent history is partly visible, partly hidden, partly buried under forests and farms and cities and the accumulated weight of human civilization. I see approximately 200 confirmed impact craters and, almost certainly, many hundreds or thousands more that we have not yet recognized, disguised as ordinary terrain, waiting for the right geologist to notice that a valley is a little too circular, a lake a little too perfectly round, a region's mineral chemistry a little too anomalous to be explained by the usual processes. In each of those wounds, confirmed or unconfirmed, I now see something I did not used to see. A possible cradle, a possible reactor, a possible place where, billions of years ago, the chemistry ran long enough and got lucky enough to produce something that would eventually, in some chain of events almost incomprehensibly long and complicated, lead to everything. And when I look at a map of Mars, which is to say, when I look at a planet that is essentially nothing but craters, craters everywhere, craters of every size and every age and every degree of preservation, stacked and overlapping and stretching from pole to pole in numbers that run into the hundreds of thousands, the feeling is even stronger. Because if the crater origin hypothesis is right, then Mars is not just a cratered desert. It is the most heavily seeded origin of a life landscape in the inner solar system. It is a planet that ran the same experiment Earth ran, possibly with the same frequency, possibly with the same results, for the same window of time during which liquid water was present and the impacts were arriving, and the hydrothermal systems were running. We are about to start opening boxes from one of those craters in the form of the samples Perseverance has been collecting from the Jezero Delta. Those samples will come back to Earth within the next 10 to 20 years. They will go into laboratories equipped with every tool modern science can bring to bear, and the people running those laboratories will be looking, with new eyes, for exactly the kind of signal that the Korean team found in the Hapcheon cores. If they find it, if the Jezero samples contain layered biological architecture, biosignature chemistry, the structural record of a microbial community that once lived in a Martian crater lake, then we will be holding in our hands the evidence of a second origin of life. Not a descendant of Earth life, not contamination, not an artifact. A second independent start, a second time the universe ran this experiment and got a result. And in that moment, the question will stop being whether life can begin on other worlds and become something far more unsettling and far more wonderful. It will become, how often does this happen? How many times has this experiment run? Across how many worlds? Across how many solar systems? In the 4 billion years since the first stars started making the heavy elements? that rocky planets and asteroids and living things are built from. Maybe, after all of this, the simplest way to put it is this. We have been telling ourselves a story about the origin of life in which the cradle is calm and dark and deep and stable. The vents at the bottom of the ocean, quiet, eternal, slow. A story that feels, emotionally, like the universe nurturing something fragile in a protected place. But the actual cradle, the real one, if Hapcheon is any guide, may have been something else entirely. Loud, hot, bright, brief by geological standards. A freshwater lake sitting inside an asteroid wound, mixing the chemistry of Earth and space, cycling through wet and dry and hot and cool for 20,000 years or more, with stromatolite communities slowly, patiently assembling themselves at the shoreline, recording their world in stone, building the architecture of early life one season at a time. If that is true, then every time you look up at the night sky and catch a meteor streaking across it, that brief bright scratch of light that is gone before you can quite point at it, you are looking at a tiny version of the same kind of event that may have written the original chapter of life on this planet. Not a threat. Not a random bit of space debris, a seed delivery, a chemistry reset, a small echo of the process that, billions of years ago, kept making new wounds in the young Earth until one of those wounds finally became a cradle. And every time you look down at the ground beneath your feet, you are standing on a planet that may be structurally, fundamentally, geologically inclined to keep trying to start life. A self-resetting biochemical laboratory. A world that does not just host life, but keeps generating the conditions for life to begin every time the solar system sends another rock its way, and the wound fills with water, and the chemistry starts again. We are all, every one of us, descendants of one particular round of that experiment, the one that worked, the one whose chemistry crossed the threshold, whose biology survived long enough to spread beyond its crater, whose lineage diversified and adapted and eventually, after billions of years of branching and changing, produced something that could look up at the sky and start wondering where it came from. The answer, it turns out, may have been written in scars all along, across this planet, across the surface of Mars, across every rocky, water-rich, impact-cratered world that has ever existed in this solar system or any other. We just had to learn how to read them, and we are only now, finally, at the very beginning of learning how to do that. Which means the most important discoveries in this story have not happened yet. They are coming, in the next decade, in the Jezero samples, in the next crater that someone decides to drill for reasons that seem, at the time, merely geological. The rice field in South Korea is not the end of this story. It is, in every sense that matters, the first sentence.